welcome to the first presentation of today and of this event. I'm very happy to introduce Marita Freimane, and the interesting thing is that she's somewhere on the move for a while. Marita is a doctoral student at KU Leuven, and at the same time, I think, postdoctoral researcher in Zurich, which seems great, right? So you're still doing your PhD and you're already a postdoctoral researcher. And well, so it's a transition period, and we're excited to hear about your work on platform bargaining. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Martin, for the nice introduction and for the opportunity to present my paper here today on the effect of platform bargaining regulation on content display. Let's check how this is working. Yeah, it's working well. Great. So the very broad motivation for this project has been that we all know that digital platforms are central to our economies, but there's still a lot of debate going on about the right tools to regulate them. And here, more specifically, the policy issue that I focus on is how large platforms can leverage their market power when negotiating with their suppliers, and this can become a particular concern if the weaker party, as is the case with news media, generate some sort of positive externality, a social benefit. More specifically, here I look at a particular regulatory response by the Australian government, which passed rather novel regulation that mandated platforms to bargain with news content providers to reimburse them for their content. And the idea with this regulation is to increase the bargaining power of the content providers to then enable redistribution of some of the surplus. And even more specifically, this study focuses on how implementing such regulation can have unintended consequences with respect to what content gets displayed, because it leads to changes in the relative cost of different types of content, news content. But before I go more into the specific details of this project, I wanted to take a step back and in part to just kind of introduce you to this kind of regulation and why it does have these kind of nice appealing theoretical properties, and also why such regulations have particularly targeted the media industry. And as I mentioned, exactly, so the idea of this kind of regulation is to try to strengthen this weaker party by mandating this kind of bargaining, but it also, the other thing that's appealing about this kind of regulation is that it's supposed to leverage the private information of the bargaining parties. And this is particularly relevant in the news media industry and in general at digital markets, where you have like high number of highly heterogeneous goods, and you often have either zero prices towards the consumer, so you just don't observe the prices. And thus, this is a way to kind of avoid getting the regulator involved and sort of instead leverage the private information of these bargaining parties. And the way that this kind of regulation is supposed to contribute to strengthening the bargaining position of the weaker party is that it sort of sets a fixed time frame within which you have to reach an agreement. And if you fail to do so, there is something called the final offer arbitration stage, in which each of the parties has to submit a final offer. And sort of the idea is that this should incentivize negotiated deals in the first place, because nobody wants to reach this arbitration stage because it's highly uncertain which deal would be chosen. And even if you do reach this stage, it incentivizes reasonable offers, because otherwise, if your offer is sort of too outrageous in a sense, it's unlikely to be chosen. So this is why this kind of regulation is, at least theoretically, highly appealing. And so the reason why these kind of regulations have focused on news industry is in part, as I mentioned, because the news industry provides an important social good in form of an informed society, in form of keeping our politicians accountable, etc. But at the same time, as we all know, and that's why obviously, I guess we're here for the media funding conference, the media industry has struggled financially in the past decades with the move from print news to digital news, and sort of people's unwillingness to pay for subscriptions for digital news, combined with sort of the increased sort of reliance on advertising that the newspapers have, and this industry being highly concentrated in the digital advertising. And sort of the idea that the regulators have here is that they would then, because they can't address this advertising market directly, they focus on another market where the platforms interact with news publishers, and they try to mandate the the platforms to bargain with news publishers for the content that they display on their platforms. And hopefully this way sort of reimburse the publishers and address their financial pressures and kind of ensure that we can continue providing quality journalism. I just wanted to say something about sort of why I think it's in particular important to understand this Australian regulation, and that's in part because there's many other countries that are considering something similar, and that includes Canada, that actually passed a similar regulation this year, just earlier this year, but also UK, US, South Africa, Brazil, and other countries. So it just goes to underscore why it's important to fully understand this first example set by Australia, where they implemented this regulation. So finally, I just want to present my research question here, which is specifically what happens to content on Google News, which is one of the affected platforms, once Google has to start paying for news. And I also already want to just give you a brief idea of the findings. So I do indeed find that the content that's displayed on Google News changes significantly, and in particular, I observed that it is the larger foreign publishers that seem to benefit, while it is the larger domestic publishers that are hurt. And this is likely related to the fact that the relative cost of the different types of content changes for the platform. And also intuitively, there seems to be more of a bigger effect in kind of topics where there are just simply more alternatives available, such as in global news topics, where the foreign news publishers are more likely to provide news content. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to say in the introduction is just a few words about the existing literature on the relationship between aggregated platforms and their content providers, and how my paper relates to it. So the paper that's most closely related to my paper is by Luca Sandrini and Robert Somogyi, and this is a theoretical paper where they show that this kind of regulation has the potential to improve total welfare and will never harm consumers. So the important difference in this setting to my empirical setting is that they assume that all the transfers between the platform and the publishers are lump sum, whereas in my empirical setting you also observe transfers that are proportionate to the content that's displayed, and that will have important implications to what I find in terms of effects on the content. And so the second stream of literature here is much broader, and that looks specifically on this kind of monetary transfers that are proportionate to the amount of content that's displayed, the amount of clicks on that content. And this basically shows that, and this is theoretical literature that basically shows that this leads the platform to bias or like to change what kind of content they choose to display and how. And what I contribute here is basically I show that this kind of also happens empirically, that we can observe this empirically. And finally, there's the literature that focuses on news aggregators specifically, and this mostly has focused on what are the effects of, in this case, of exit of a news aggregator from a specific market. And they do find that there's a significant effect on the traffic to news publishers' websites from such exit, which just points towards that even in my case, where we don't observe exit, but rather arrangement of content, there's likely to be an effect on traffic to the websites. So I wanted to, before I go into the empirical analysis, I wanted to provide a bit more details on the specific regulation, which then also kind of sets up for the analysis. And so this regulation, it's a competition law-based regulation, which was generally developed to target dominant platforms, but specifically always had Google and Facebook in mind. But in future, this could theoretically also involve other platforms. It was enacted more than 2.5 years ago, so in March 2021. However, actually, it does not formally apply in the sense that no platform has formally been designated to be subject to this regulation. Nevertheless, this regulation seems to have been sufficient to persuade both Google and Facebook to conclude a large number of licensing deals with the publishers. And there's a general broad agreement that this is unlikely to have happened absent this kind of regulation there. And for this reason, that these deals have likely been concluded because of this regulation. I think it's important to also understand some of the details of it because they likely have influenced how these deals look like. So, for example, this on the publisher side, this kind of regulation applies to Australian newspapers. So for the simple reason that the Australian government can't really they just don't have the jurisdiction over sort of Google negotiating with New York Times, for example. And this will lead to my first hypothesis, which is that we're likely to observe some substitution from domestic content to foreign content because the foreign content still remains free for Google and for the other platforms. Furthermore, there's a minimum turnover threshold, which will be in partly contributing to my second hypothesis that we are likely to observe some substitution away from the larger publishers towards the smaller publishers because the content from those is relatively cheaper now. And finally, this regulation is supposed to apply to news that are sort of importance to Australians. And this is a very general definition that they provide in this regulation, but the way I interpret it is basically I narrow down my analysis to current news issues, both domestically and globally, rather than something like entertainment or sports news. And then, so as I said, so this regulation doesn't formally apply, which is in part why we don't know very much in great detail about how these deals look like. But what we do know is that the overall amount of transfers is rather large. So it's about 200 million of Australian dollars annually. And just to give you sort of a sense of how much this is about 20% of annual salaries for journalists in Australia. So it's sizable. And then what we know basically about the individual deals is that they seem to broadly fall into two categories. So the smaller publishers seem to have received more of a lump sum offer that's based on some sort of formula based on audience size, volume of content, and other things. Whereas the larger publishers seem to have been able to negotiate more customized offers, which in part include ad revenue sharing, which suggests then that there's a component to these deals that is dependent on the amount of content that's being displayed on the platform. And this is the main contributor to my second hypothesis that we might observe some substitution from the larger publishers towards the smaller publishers. And yes, I just wanted to summarize again the two hypotheses that then I set out to test. And one is that we might observe some substitution from domestic to foreign news websites because the foreign content remains free. And we might also observe some substitution from the larger towards the smaller domestic websites because the reimbursement to the larger websites is a function of the amount of content displayed, whereas that for the smaller websites is a lump sum. But of course, all of this will be constrained by the availability of appropriate substitutes. And so I just wanted to give another example where I think something like this might actually be going on, is that even before the enactment of this regulation, Google appears to have been experimenting with the algorithm in precisely the kind of way that we would imagine based on what I was just saying. So here what you see is on the left-hand, so you have the same search terms in Google search, and on the left-hand side, you have all the traditional Australian newspapers, including the Australian Financial Review, Sydney Morning Herald, the Australian, while on the right-hand side, we see one foreign publisher and two smaller publishers. So exactly kind of what I was just saying earlier. So before I get to the empirical analysis, I still want to say just a few words on the data I use. So as Martin was saying, data access can be sometimes challenging when studying the digital markets, but basically what I do here, as many people do, I scrape data. I scrape the data from the front page of the Google News aggregator for about 8 months before and after the regulation in Australia and a number of different other comparison countries. Multiple times a day, I basically connect to the VPN in that country to kind of get access to the news content that readers in that country will access. And then basically I gather all kinds of information from the front page of the website, including the topic of the news, the order in which they are presented, the website of the news outlet, the time when it was published, etc. And then importantly, I also add information on the country of that news website to be able to do this analysis of looking at whether they affect, whether we observe any substitution to the foreign content. And the other piece of data that I wanted to share, the other piece of information about the data that I wanted to share is that perhaps unsurprisingly, the share of the articles, the market shares are highly skewed. You see a couple of very large publishers, then you have sort of like this longer tail of medium-sized publishers, and then many, many very small publishers. And what you also see, so here with these green boxes, I've highlighted the foreign publishers, which then amount to a total of about 15% of the total content, which just suggests that there is some room for substitution. So now the empirical strategy the approach I take is a difference in differences analysis. And before I formally define the model that I estimate, I just wanted to kind of have a bit of an informal discussion of how I choose a comparison group for Australian news publishers. And so I end up with New Zealand and South Africa as the control groups. And this is in part because, like in Australia, you have mostly domestic news. So these are English language speaking countries where most of the news are domestic, but you still have a considerable share, also about 15% of news that come from other English language speaking countries, in particular the UK and the US. And perhaps more importantly, there's no upcoming regulation similar to that in Australia during this period that I study, which, for example, is why I can't choose Canada as a comparison, even though it's perhaps more appropriate in size, more similar in size to Australia. Then here, this is the multiple difference in differences equation I estimate, and please bear with me for a moment. So the outcome I look at is the daily article share per country and website. And then basically this highlighted bit here is the treatment effect, but the first two terms, as I already mentioned, I actually don't expect there to be an effect that is common for all the publishers in Australia or all the domestic publishers in Australia. But instead, I expect there to be a positive effect for the large foreign publishers and then a negative effect for large domestic publishers, so that there would be an effect that's a function of the size of the publisher. And this then corresponds to the two hypotheses. And of course, for this to identify the causal effect, we'd have to be willing to make a number of assumptions. But here I just wanted to focus on just showing you that we at least seem to have parallel trends prior to the treatment, both in New Zealand, as you can see, but then also in in South Africa, even if here maybe it moves around a little bit more. Yeah, and so finally we can get to the results. And for the main results, I aggregate the data across all the main topics, so headlines, which is just a mix of current news, and then global news and domestic Australian news. And here, indeed, so the first two lines, you see the effect is not significant. As as is expected, but then instead what we do see is a positive effect for the foreign publishers, which is basically for each 1% of pre-treatment market share or article share that the publisher has, we see about 1/3 of a percentage point increase in the market share. And conversely, for the domestic publishers, we actually see a negative effect. So for each 1% pre-treatment share, we see about a 0.03 to 0.09 percentage point decrease. And this is the main result. And I also wanted to share with you a few of the heterogeneity analysis and robustness analysis, which at least to me show that this result moves intuitively and gives me more confidence in this main result. And so one of the things I wanted to show is how it looks like when I split the data by topic. So here specifically, I ran split sample analysis for global news and domestic Australian news. And here you can see that for global news, you have a lot more websites. So a lot more possible substitutes than for domestic Australian news. And you also indeed see that there's a lot stronger effect in terms of substitution for this world news than for domestic Australian news, where in fact you don't see a significant effect, as we would also perhaps expect. And then another robustness check I wanted to share is an analysis where I just aggregate the data by the ownership, which actually is the level at which the publishers, or at which the negotiations took place. And to me, it's reassuring that the effect actually here is both larger, but also more precisely estimated for the domestic publishers, which kind of is in line with that. This is the level at which the negotiations actually take place. And so I just wanted to conclude. I'm not sure how I'm doing with the time. Okay, good. Yeah, I just wanted to briefly then conclude, and I hope that I've given you, or I've tried to convince you that I can provide causal evidence here that this kind of regulation did have effect on what kind of content was displayed. And to me, this analysis has two main takeaways. And one is that Google as a gatekeeper platform appears to have some ability to substitute content towards less expensive content. But at the same time, I would say these effects are not very large, which just also suggests that it is constrained by consumer demand and by availability of substitutes. And the second takeaway I would have is that mandating lump sum payments and also then perhaps introducing similar regulations in other countries would further limit the incentives and ability for the platform to alter its ranking. And that's it for me. Thank you.